If you enjoyed my recaps of the 2024 FIDE candidates, you're going to love this one. It's GM Max here, and we are going to go through the Sigeman chess tournament that only just finished a couple of days ago. Even if you already know results, I believe that this recap will give you a lot of really clear and quick insights into the main lessons to take away from these games, so that, well, you can enjoy the tournament and also apply them in your own games. That being said, let's introduce the players. We had Marc-Andre Morizzi, the World Junior Champion 2023, playing this tournament. Vincent Keymer, you can also see here, one of the top junior players and Germany's top player, also in the event. I also had Korobov, a very creative Ukrainian Grandmaster. Nodirbek Abdusattorov, I think he's the world number 5, if I remember correctly, on the live ratings currently. But yeah, he was in the tournament. Also, Arjun Erigaisi, who was, I think, the second seed going into this event from memory. Also, Zhu Wenjun, the women's world champion. And then the field finally was rounded out with Peter Svidler, previously a world-class grandmaster, still well in the top 100. And of course, one of the world's very best chess commentators. And you had a local hero, Niels Grau-Delius, Sweden's top player. So that was the field, all very exciting and interesting players. So we were sure to really have a great event ahead for us. By the way, if you are enjoying this video, do make sure to leave a like and also to think about subscribing. Those of you who've watched my channel a lot will notice by now, but just a friendly reminder that if you click the notification bell and you set the settings to all, that'll ensure you'll be able to catch all of my videos, that you're not going to miss out on something important for you. With that being said, let's dive into the first game. By the way, for these games, if there's a game that just ends up being a bit of a boring draw, I'm probably just going to skip it. But this one actually featured a kind of interesting opening idea in the semi-Slav Moscow variation. Of course, white has the bishop, black has the bishop pair, but white has a bit of space and development in return. Normally white goes e3, and you can usually choose between a setup with g6, something like this, and there are some other approaches black can play as well, like putting the bishop on d6, as it were, but yeah, these are sort of the main contours, let's say. But white played this move of a3, which at first glance might just seem like a mistake, but there is actually an idea behind this move, which does come up in the game, and that is after b5 and knight to e5. So normally here, this would just be a really bad idea because of the move bishop to d6 hitting the knight, which is indeed what Keymer played. I suppose to be fair, in the worst case, you could play f4 and anchor the knight, but it's not absolutely ideal. But Morizzi's idea is that he can now play the move knight to e4. And if black could just play bishop b4 check, this just wouldn't make any sense. But now the move a3 is stopped at. Kind of tells you a little bit about how modern chess develops. And in the rising position, white actually had pretty decent compensation here. You could argue maybe knight c5 wasn't absolutely ideal, but it's what was played in the game. Bishop to d6, knight e4. Black didn't just repeat moves, but decided to keep the game going with castles. And this was really the key moment of the game, and basically a good example of what's known as the comparison method in chess. I realize that those who haven't followed my content for a long time might need a little refresher on this, but a comparison method basically refers to comparing two similar moves or two similar continuations and figuring out, well, what exactly is the difference between them. And it turns out the correct idea for white is basically to go for g4, g5 and go for the attack on black's king. But what exactly is the right move order to do this? Now, it turns out the best move order, which I think Keymer also noted after the game, is to play rook g1 and basically prepare the move of g4 and g5, as it were. I suppose in theory you could also play knight d6 and do it this way, but maybe it's not absolutely in the spirit of the position, as it were. I think rook g1 just works a lot better. But Morizzi kind of asks a question that you often recommend my students ask, if you're playing move A to prepare move B, you should ask yourself, well, can't we just play to move B immediately? Honestly, I should probably at some point get this pattern as the Illingworth principle, because I've sort of mentioned I think more than anyone else as far as I know. But yeah, in this case, it turns out the Illingworth principle is actually not so effective, where you should, of course, check the details, because chess, a lot of it is just a game of tricks to make your ideas work. And with c5, we can kind of see the problem. This knight just sort of ends up like a deer in the headlights. And after bishop g2, cd4, Maurizi tried to make the best of it, just sacking the pawns and trying to get at the black king. But we can ignore the threat on the h6 pawn, and in the game, black just was able to fully consolidate, like g6, and white is just getting completely murdered. The rest of the game was of no real consequence. Black just went on to win very comfortably. And as you might have seen when I was introducing the players, this was actually a very, very exciting round of chess, where we had Korobov score an upset win against Abdusattorov. There were a few interesting points to the opening, like this queen b3 move is definitely an intriguing alternative to the standard knight d5, queen b3 just being a way to avoid double pawns and just get a game. But I'm also aware, that not a lot of you guys play the English, and this is sort of, maybe not the most interesting part of the game. So I'm just going to fast forward a little bit so that you can kind of see where as the game starts to heat up. Because I think for all these moves, like, some of you guys might feel that some of them are a little bit unnatural. Like, you might think the doubled pawns are a little bit odd for both sides. But when both sides have doubled pawns, it kind of even things out a little bit. d6, bishop b2. And it might appear that white's just winning the pawn on d4, but as you might expect with Abdusattorov, he always has a trick, and the move f5 was his trick to be able to, get back the pawn in this way, and well, to sort of fight for the initiative. So white played the move of bishop to d4, f takes e4, queen to c3, just keeping the tension by both sides. This is a very standard technique among grandmasters. They're not going to rush to take on d4 or take on c5 and just improve the position of the opponent. But they're just going to keep the tension and just keep the game going. In fact, it's kind of interesting that when white does release the tension with bishop c3, that it might actually not be the best move, that, going a3 and b4 is probably a more intelligent way to release the tension, so that, you can sort of force a favorable exchange for yourself and try to get at the pawn. Though, of course, black would still be totally fine, and, might even argue his space gives him some play, but as the game played out, it wasn't perfect, but both sides, I think, made pretty logical moves in general. Both sides continuing to build up on the queen's side. The pawn on d5 might look a little bit weak at the moment, but it is defended very well by the bishop, and it's kind of hard for our own bishop to get to it. And black also has counterplay, played rook c4, hitting this guy. And the key moment of the game essentially came around, if I just fast forward a little bit, around here it looks like black's actually starting to do quite well with the passed c-pawn, and if black plays c2 and just kind of builds up like rook c5 and, just kind of brings the pieces to better squares, black is going to have control, and white will have his work cut out a little bit to make sure he survives this. But in the game after queen f6 and queen d7, like here black should probably just accept these kind of lost the advantage and, play a move like queen f6 and just, accept the game will end in a draw. Of course, Abdusattorov is, a very ambitious player. Like, he's going to fight for the win in almost any position, actually. In this particular game, though, it kind of cost him, where the move rook d8, c5 is just tactically failing, in a sense. I think his idea is he probably wanted to go rook d5 and try to bring the rook in, and, even this is maybe not entirely successful, but the big problem, though, is Korobov's move of queen d8, where in this way, white is just able to grab a pawn with impunity. c2, you're just going to take the bishop and black has nothing. So queen e7. Apparently the move bishop f1 was very strong, but it's a little bit of a computerish move to, to bring the bishop around like this. But I think the idea is that so you can play like queen a7 and sort of make sure the pawn's defended. But like I said, very computerish approach to the position. Korobov's queen a5 hitting the pawn is arguably a bit more natural. But it does give black moves like queen d7 to try to bring the queen in like this. Note, of course, that rook c3 would, run into some tricks that you would definitely rather avoid. So white goes queen a2. And this point's a position where, like, if black plays correctly, they can probably hold. Like, if they play queen d2 and, just get into an ending and make that passed pawn really strong, then, black will probably survive. But after rook c8, it's a very different story, and Korobov just found exactly the right moves to keep the control, like, protect his king, target the pawn on c3. And now the queen was also free just to kind of dominate the bishop and the rook that have been left behind. Of course, a move like rook b8 just runs into queen c7, and you just lose a piece that way. But after bishop a8, queen d7, again, white is just having a full control of the position. where once he rounds up the c3 pawn, black simply has nothing. And after a few not so relevant moves, yeah, the game was over and black just resigned, being down 2 pawns and facing the monster passer on the b file. I also spent a lot of time on this game, but I do think this was one of the more interesting games of the tournament, to my mind. Whereas if you look at the other decisive game, Erigaisi against Xu Wenjun, I mean, this game definitely had its highlights, but I think that it was basically a game of one move, where I hope you'll forgive me for accelerating a little bit past these moves. But I mean, a lot of this is kind of standard theory. White is going to try to leverage the power of the fianchettoed bishop, while black is going to also rely on sort of her active piece play that you often get in the Grunfeld to maintain the balance. Worth pointing out also, dc5 might appear to be a pawn grab. Well, I suppose it is, but black does get good play with knight fd7, where they will be able to regain the pawn and get decent play here. So Erigaisi played bishop d2, sort of make it where instead he's kind of the one that offers the pawn sacrifice, but sort of get some good lead-in development in return. And although black has succeeded with her last moves in trading off white's strong fianchettoed bishop, the price she pays it with cd4, she is actually sacrificing the exchange. And yeah, it's true that black is getting good compensation. It will take some time for the knight to get back into play. But in some later moves, yeah, she admittedly misplayed a little bit. Erigaisi, being a very dynamic player, wanted to sacrifice a second pawn in order to maximize the activity of his pieces. Definitely, I think, a very good practical approach. And black's best bet might even be to do something similar, like to play knight d7, even offer up the pawn on b7, but just getting some very nice piece activity. Well, actually, there's a little bit of a trick here. Queen b7, queen e4 does, fork the bishop and the knight at the same time. So that is a thing. But b6, yeah, for that reason, turned out to be slightly superfluous, given that queen b7 actually wasn't a threat just yet. And around this point, yeah, if black plays the normal bishop takes f6, I think she's probably doing fine. Like, it's true that knight d5 is probably what she was concerned about in the game. But after knight c5, it turns out black's position is actually very robust here. That, for example, a move like knight f6 you're not really concerned about as black, because your knight just anchors this pawn very well, and it's actually black who is going to be better here because of the weakness of the white king in this position. But instead after ef6, yeah, the game just really turned in white's favor, where, once the queens and piece were traded, like, this ending is basically just going to be a win for white, where the rook and king are just going to kind of outflank the knight, and yeah, the game was over in a few more moves, where black resigned in this instance. So yeah, another fairly clear-cut game, and Svetha Grandelius had some somewhat interesting opening ideas, but I think the game itself was a little bit dry, so I'm going to skip past it just so the recap's not like 2 hours long or more. The next game also against Maritzi against Korobov. This is one that, I mean, it was a game that was sort of, black was always pressing in this a6 open Catalan, but white did have some ideas to try to, get some counterplay and, to try and save the game. This a4, a5 is actually a very interesting idea, where you sort of end up sacrificing a pawn, say with knight bd2, but where you sacrifice a pawn, but you do get a nice lead in development and, some active piece play in return down the queenside files. Almost like a kind of Benko gambit if the pawn was on like b2 instead of c2, you could say. And you guys know already, yeah, that I love the Benko gambit as one of my old favorite openings. But yeah, in this game I played knight a3, sort of going for it in this way. And yeah, instead of the move queen b3, I suggested white played the move knight fe5. And admittedly, this combined with d5 was probably not ideal, where a trick that often works when you are up a pawn is just to give back the pawn in a smart way to consolidate your development. And, of course, bishop d5 is not really so appealing when black is going to get the bishop pair and the rook is also going to be forced in an awkward spot. Yeah, a position like this is just an absolute dream with the bishop pair and very strong queenside majority to work with. But yeah, after knight e3, like, white just never really managed to get full compensation, and I'm not going to go through the full game because otherwise the video would be a bit too long, but black did go on to convert his extra pawn into a win from this position. We eventually end up pushing the queenside majority forward and leveraging that advantage. The next game between Zhu and Jun against Peter Svidler. One thing you'll notice is, like, yeah, Zhu had a bit of a difficult start to the tournament, but a little bit of a teaser. She did have a very strong comeback, actually, later on, to end up having a pretty good result. And yeah, she often likes to play these kind of Catalan-style approaches, but with Sidler playing a slightly different move order, delaying knight gf6, she decided to also be a little bit creative and play d5 and knight c3, which I'd say is like almost in kind of an Illingworth-style spirit with how I often played a lot of g3 positions with the white pieces. Like, not playing super theoretical, but just kind of playing logical moves to, leverage the power of the g2 bishop. And, if White plays a move like a4 here, I do think that this idea of playing a5, a6, and just trying to weaken the black queen side, it does ask some questions, because a move like a5 might seem automatic, but then knight c4 becomes more effective. It's much harder to kick the knight away later now with the pawn on a4. And we also have ideas of bringing the bishop to a3 that, again, are more effective when you're not blocking the a-pawn. Which I is like, it's a very subtle point, but something that can make the difference at high level. But knight c4 is played immediately. Of course, this is not ever really going to be a mistake per se, but it does give black this time to play e4 until you get this reasonable counterplay. And at a certain point, yeah, white just kind of made a bit of a strange move. Specifically here, I think that the move that white played is sort of missing a little bit the point of the position, where what white need to play here is a move of bishop g5, just kind of clearing the way for the knight to come to e3 and a d5 to leverage the pin. I mean, I'm guessing that, Zhu was maybe concerned the queen is somehow getting trapped here, but again, if you go bishop f5 and try to clear the way for the rook, white just has knight e3, and yeah, your queen is always going to be safe on such an open board. But instead, after queen d1, yeah, now it just shifts in black's favor, where it's not so easy to find a convenient square for the knight, and the Indian suggestion of rook a4 is already a little bit awkward, but still this was probably better than the game, because in this position, so white, yeah, is trying to win the pawn on e4, but turns out we can actually ignore it, as often the case with the best moves in chess. That's about not necessarily stopping the opponent's threat, but just finding a better threat of our own. And even though white is currently up a pawn here, the position is actually just a complete mess for white, because the e3 pawn is very, very weak here. White is not going to be able to keep this this weakling alive forever as such. And Fiddler, yeah, just went on to win a very convincing game. Like, h5 is a good example of just keeping the control, not giving white any constructive ideas. To my mind, bishop h6 is probably more natural, but as a more natural move order to my mind. But knight c5 is also reasonable, and yeah, that's the way it played out. Black is, yeah, maybe still down a pawn, but black just has all of the ideas in this position, and yeah, black went on to convert with this idea of sort of swinging the bishop to e5, fixing his pawn's a weakness, bring the rook in, and yeah, white just wasn't really able to defend all of her weaknesses at the end of the day. So quite a nice win to Svidler, and this next game is one I think was probably one of the most anticipated matchups going into the tournament, but the Rising position just didn't really have that much, maybe so much flavor to it. I mean, Abdusattorov did come up with a kind of interesting idea of like playing bishop d2, and it's coming out with this completely new approach of sorts to the slow Slav, but theoretically, I think it's not so dangerous. I think that in this position, if anyone's better here, it's actually probably black as such, where I think that the knights coordinate very well and the bishops are sort of hitting air or just biting on granite. And you could argue, with the move g5, this pawn even becomes a bit of a target later on. But okay, it's true that, Erigaisi didn't play it in the best way, and Abdusattorov did get a chance later on. But like I said, yeah, if we cover every single one of these draws, the recap will just take forever. So I am going to fast forward to a little bit more of an interesting game in the one between Keymer against Grandelius. And I'll say that if you find the Chevenenko style approach as Slav annoying to face, I think that this game will give you quite a bit of inspiration. Because it's actually funny, because I actually covered this a6 line in a chessable course I kind of drafted recently. But the main line here is basically to go for b3 and, sort of play out these sorts of positions, like castles and, all this sort of thing. Well, yeah, you do have to be careful not to fall for knight takes d5. This does actually threaten to win a pawn once white castles. But you can get out of it with like queen e7 and, basically be doing okay here. And, Keymer has often some quite creative ideas in the opening. Of course, a very well-prepared player, as you'd expect from the Germans. And, yeah, this a3 move might look very weird, but it's actually not such a bad idea in this position. Because it's basically, a6 we think about is kind of a waiting move, and we're playing a little bit of a waiting move ourselves that also is slightly useful. Because, like, let's say if black plays dc4 and plays in a Moran style, well, now you have a full extra tempo compared to a Moran, let's say. And you could probably also argue even a4 and, doing it this way and stopping b5 is also a very legitimate idea in this position. So black just played knight bd7, just played it steadily. But now we can play queen c2, where c5 is a lot less effective for black when we don't have knight c6 to leverage that c6 square that's opened up. So the game went b6, and yeah, you can sort of make the point that, neither side's move of a6 or h3 is ideal. But still, you get a position, bishop b4, and actually it turns out this whole line that we see here, and I realize I'm fast forwarding a little bit, but just sort of get to the more critical position of the game. Of course, knight d5 is, you don't really want to self-pin in such a position, but yeah, c4, rook 81, it turns out this was actually all prepared by the players before the game, and Keymer here found this very interesting idea of rook to d4, just preparing to build up and potentially swing the rook over and just have some very nice ideas of attacking the black king. And Grandelius had actually had this position on his laptop just before the game, but basically couldn't remember exactly what you're meant to do here. Turns out there are a few approaches, but rook c8 is probably the most natural move, just making sure that all the pieces are fully developed, and after rook fd1, queen e7, white has some ideas to attack, but if black defends precisely, then admittedly he should probably be fine in this instance. Like bishop b1 immediately, you can just go g6 and sort of blunt the bishop a bit in this way. But instead, Grandelius played a more prophylactic move of h6, which looks very natural, but actually is a little bit of a mistake here. The first point being that, when your knight gets to f5, now they can't really kick it away so easily. So that's a very important dynamic aspect of the position. And also when you play bishop b1, they can't really, play g6 quite as easily, because then that pawn will be a bit more tender. And yeah, I mean, from here it's true that queen e7 is probably a mistake, but yeah, already black is feeling a bit of the pressure, and, his best bet might actually be to just try and release the tension as soon as possible, rather than facing such a strong attack as it happened in the game. Like, rook f4 is just a really great move by Keymer, just threatening some mating ideas with the queen coming in by removing the defender of h7. And after bishop c3, taken bishop e4, black is able to exchange off this bishop, but at a very high price because of the destruction that's going to happen to his kingside pawns. And after knight b5, very nice tactic by Keymer to play rook takes, realizing at bishop d5, rook f6, that this sort of attack is basically just giving checkmate in a sense. And in the game after knight d5, white just had 2 minor pieces for the rook and 2 pawns. But when white also has the initiative as well, then it's just going to be a winning position for white. There's only a few more moves, so I'll just show it to the end. It'll be easier than giving some very long-winded explanation. But white's just basically going to use the pieces to, just fire everything at the black king, and there's just not a lot you can really do in response. After queen c5, take, knight d7, white is winning a piece to have a decisive material advantage, and this is why Grandelius resigned here. So going into 2 rounds here, we can see that there were 2 players on 2 out of 2, Vincent Keymer and Anton Korobov. And it's kind of fitting that they actually played in round 3, but there are a couple of other games, well, that were played before that. Now, for this next game, this one did end up being a pretty sort of balanced kind of draw where, this knight e6 system is one that Abdusattorov did return to later in this tournament. We'll get to that nearer to the end of the recap. But I just want to fast forward a little bit just to one kind of key position that arose in this game, because it sort of struck me as a very interesting decision. Because here, I think that in this position, if white just plays queen to c2 and just plays very steadily, like just build up the pressure on the d-pawn, go b4 and just grab space, I do think it's a position where white's bishop in the long run is going to be better than black's bishop. So it's a bit surprising to me when Svidler played queen e5 and, basically just very blatantly played for a draw from this kind of position. Of course, the game kind of loses its interest a bit from this point, but I did think this was an interesting decision worth, pointing out before we move on to the next game. As for the Grandelius Zhu and Jun game, actually there was a very interesting position that came up later in the endgame, where Grandelius kind of outplayed Zhu a bit in this exchange QGD. Normally everyone plays just bishop h4 and keeps the pin, but Grandelius decided to play bishop f4 and just kind of get a position to play instead, making the point that a lot of the times black will be playing like bishop d6 in one go. In a bishop f4 subs to trade the bishop, but of course that would take an extra tempo here. Okay, it's not my purpose to really analyze this game in general, but it's just that playing out the moves quickly is going to be like just as fast if I, try to find like the relevant position. But looking at this structure, you can kind of see like how the knight versus bishop imbalance does give white some scope to play for the win, even though the computer will tell you that it's just a draw. It's not that simple in the human level. F4 is a nice move, trying to, secure that F4 outpost for the knights. To avoid this, Zhu played just Gf3, Rook C8, take. All this is reasonably standard, but you can also say white does start to outplay black a little bit over the next moves. Deciding to get in with the rook, create some weaknesses. Because from white's point of view, white wants to try to get as many of these pawns fixed on the light squares as possible to make the bishop very weak and allow us to, kind of get in on the dark squares. So we have a little bit of maneuvering. White is, trying to squeeze the blood out of a stone, which is kind of fitting actually, given that Grandelius used to be one of Magnus Carlsen's seconds. I don't know if he still is or not, but at least in the past World Championship match, they, trained a bit together. But yeah, you can sort of see white is starting to make just some very small inroads at some point. Grandelius also very tricky play, setting up some potential discoveries against the bishop, which, black just, is just neutralizing a little bit. But yeah, basically if we get to around, we're almost there, just let me fast forward a little bit. Obviously you can see, getting the knight to c5 does constitute a little bit of progress for white. But yeah, it was around this point, this was the position I want to share with you guys, because it's actually a very instructive one, which I think I actually even put this one in my free Facebook group, Adult Chess Improvers, where I'll put a link to that in the description below, because I do share, currently I share like 4 posts a day actually of different content from me there, just to really help you, improve your chess as much as possible, regardless of your financial situation. So that's something, you're definitely gonna get a lot of value out of. But returning to this position here, so Grandelius made a little bit of an instructive mistake, where I think that the way white should play is just to be quite patient and just steadily improve the position. I really like a move like b4 in this position for white, with the idea that we're just going to kind of steadily grab space on the queen side and just make this position as good as possible before we kind of cash in our chips, in a sense. Now, if you want to play b5 and, get it in this way, that would also work, of course, but I do think this position is one where it's very hard for black to find a great move. You never really have b6 because of the a6 pawn being hanging, but if you go king b6 and your king is also kind of a little bit offside, and your white can even just prepare moves like f4, f5, and just kind of open up this second front to have a decisive advantage. But instead, Grandelius rushed it a little bit with knight b7, and, there are a couple of issues with this, but one kind of obvious one is that black, is able to start taking the pawns. That being said, the move that Zhu Wenjun played at king e6 is also fine, actually, where, white's best bet probably is to go king c3 and defend the pawn that way. Because the move b3 actually fell for a little bit of a trick, where the move rook h7 is actually a really nice find by Zhu Wenjun, threatening to move king f7 to trap the rook. So white has to move the rook out of the trap, but then black just regains the pawn, and the ending is just a draw here. As I just quickly play out the final moves, you'll see it for yourself that, you can't really play for a win with b4, because black can just go rook a3 and a b4, and it's just nothing here. So anyway, moving on to the next game, Korobov against Keymer. Even though it was a game between the leaders, it was actually a pretty balanced game where, Korobov was pressing a little bit at some point, but Keymer just defended very well. Like, it's an instructive game, but it's one I think most of the audience aren't going to find super interesting, so that's why I'm going to fast forward to the one decisive game of the round between Erigaisi against Moritzi. And this one actually featured this kind of modern system with CD5, the lame exchange, which, used to be just considered that, okay, this is not a very good opening because, black gets the bishop to this very strong diagonal, which is normally not so easy to achieve in the normal exchange QGD because of the pressure on d5 and on f6. But then this approach of h6 has gained a little bit of traction. And especially given that Moritzi is a very tactical and dynamic player, like almost you could say like a modern Tal of sorts, it sort of makes sense just to kind of get a position and just sort of build up a bit more steadily, where if black does play too aggressively, it will run into some problems. And yeah, here white played a move g4, just showing a good strategic awareness, just wanting to get rid of that bishop and, get this very, very reliable position where your structure is quite flexible. If you guys remember the game between Carlsen against Nepomniachtchi from the 2022 Sinkfield Cup, this is really a model example from white's point of view, and it's a game that really started to make this a trendy sort of idea from white's point of view. Knight f8's a nice move, preparing knight e6 to hit the bishop. White does a rather basic prophylaxis against this, because the position is, very sort of static, not many dynamic factors. It does afford us the time to be a little bit patient. Also, for what it's worth, a move like queen b3 could also be considered, just making the point that, white structure's a little bit inflexible, and, if you do get a move like g5, it's definitely going to be very difficult to pierce black's position, just very typical Slavic kind of ideas. In the game, though, black played bishop d8, and yeah, the key moment of the game sort of came a little bit later. Like, basically around here was sort of the key moment where black does actually have to be quite precise, because if you wait too long, the knight on h5 can definitely, be a bit of a problem on a more tactical sort of level. But black probably should have played b4 here, and okay, even then it's still actually a little bit tricky, but you kind of have to just go for like f6 and, just basically rip open the king side as quickly as possible is going to be the key before white manages to consolidate. The move in the game, knight hf4, is just not really sufficient. Because if you think about what do you need to have a successful attack on the opponent's king, well, usually you need at least one of the following four advantages, and this is sort of something I normally only really share with private students, but I think it's something that, the brighter chess world deserves to know about. So there are four types of advantages you really need for a successful attack on the king. You don't need all of them, but you need at least some of them. Having more attackers than defenders. Having weaknesses around the opponent's king that you can attack. Of course, having the initiative, having the flow of threats to keep the control of the game, as it were, and limit the opponent's defensive options. And you also need to have, well, the other type of advantage is having a space advantage around the king. Like if you had a pawn on e4, that would be a good example. And if you kind of do the shopping list of how many advantages does black have, well, okay, white's king is a little bit weak, but he doesn't really have anything else to back it up of those other three. And that's kind of the reason why white was just able to consolidate, where, yeah, you could make a point that black could play better, like, for example, queen b6 is maybe a bit better than this move of queen c8. But the point still remains that white is still going to consolidate, and, by the time you get to this point with, offering the trade of queens to, take back the initiative, because, black can't just trade to an ending where he's a piece down in this sort of case. But yeah, this allowed white just to regain the control, and, we did go on to win from this position. There were some more moves, but not the most important, let's say. So with that, we have covered it up to round 3. Looking, I can sort of see that, well, given that there are also some tie breaks at the end, it's probably we're looking at like a 50-minute or so of training. So that'll, I think, be a nice way to get a little bit in depth into these games. Now, this game between Abdusattorov and Grandelius was one that sort of piqued my interest a little bit. Because in this sort of g3 system, I think the main plan is to go c3 and, try to expand on the queen side. But maybe Abdusattorov just didn't really have any great ideas after a5 and realized that black is just going to be fine here. So he decided to transpose into the Gleck 4-knight system with knight c3, making the point that, well, maybe if you played a normal Gleck move order, maybe they would play d5 rather than bishop c5, for example. So trying to be a little tricky like that. a5, of course, very standard move, making some look for the bishop and grabbing some space on the queen side. And I think, yeah, black played the opening quite well in this game. You could make a point that maybe a move like a4 first and trying to stop the pawn on a3 maybe is a little bit more precise. Because if you do play a3 to stop it, then they're fixing two of your pawns with one of their pawns, which is a small strategic achievement, let's say. But of course, bishop e6 is never going to be a mistake in this position either. So knight a4, bishop a7, c4. Kind of transitioning almost more to kind of an English type of structure here. Like in a Botvinnik formation if the knight was on e2 instead of f3. So black played a move knight d7. If you want to play knight d4, of course, this would be fine as well to occupy the outpost. But the game saw knight d7, and yeah, Grandelius has played it very dynamically with f5. Take, knight to b5. Don't know if I'd necessarily play knight b5 above bishop e3, but for the most part, the play is reasonably standard. Bishop e3, and yeah, kind of the key moment of the game was around, so after d4, this was quite nice by Grandelius, knight b4, and, setting up some annoying moves with the minor pieces. Queen d2, bishop d3. Yeah, kind of around this point was sort of, I think, the key moment where Black should probably just play bishop h7 and, prepare for the knight to come into d3. There is still some value to have provoked the rook on c1, and, maybe it's not much for Black here, but definitely being able to, like, annoy White with the attack on the pawns and later on potentially support your knight on d3, I think is going to be quite nice for Black. But after e takes d4 already, I think that, the game, I think, loses its relevance maybe a little bit, because I think e d4, bishop b4 was, basically just fine for Black, and it was only a mistake much later on that kind of cost Black the game. But here, actually, there was a little bit of a nice opportunity where it turns out the move knight bd4 is actually very, very strong, because you're not just threatening knight takes e6, but you're also threatening the move a3 in this position, hitting the defender of the bishop. And my guess is maybe he was concerned about knight c5 or something, but after a3, it just turns out everything just works for White. You're just getting in b4, and you just basically win a piece in this way. Okay, so knight c5 isn't the reason he rejected knight bd4. It's probably more a case of it just looks so automatic to keep your pawn structure solid that it can be easy to, forget that an alternative exists. So that's kind of an instructive moment from the game. But yeah, I do want to make sure, we get through the games, let's say, a reasonable time. And the Keymer Zhu Wenjun game actually had a kind of interesting moment to it. Well, it actually had a lot of interesting moments, but I'm just going to focus on one particular one here. Also interesting to see Black playing the move of bishop f5, where, I mentioned in an earlier game, that the reason you sort of see the, this exchange reward of bishop g5 rather than knight f3 is because of the fact that, it's harder for Black to play bishop f5. So you might be wondering, well, why is Black playing bishop f5 anyway? So the drawback is that White can play queen f3. This is known as the short variation with bishop f5, where you do double their pawns and give them a weak structure. But Black does have the bishop pair advantage to compensate it, and, the theory has kind of shown that this position is basically a position that Black will be able to draw if he plays it fairly competently, or in this case, she plays it fairly competently. But yeah, White plays move knight g2, not because it's like giving White an advantage, but just trying to sort of get a position to play where, Black can't just memorize some drawing setup or something. So we had bishop e6, maybe a bit less obvious than bishop to g6, but, in the game it ends up being kind of similar anyway, because after bishop d3, h6, bishop f4, and knight to f5 are very much in the Alexander Alekhine style, this kind of knight g3, f5 approach. Well, Black was just happy to recycle the bishop, which often struggles to find a direct diagonal in this variation anyway. Of course, White should still be a bit better here with the bishop pair advantage, but Black is also reasonably solid with no major weaknesses. I think this is actually a position where bishop g3 is maybe just a little bit meek to my mind, and I think that if I was White, I would prefer to keep the tension in this way, so that our queen actually gets to a better square when you recapture. I think it's just much more logical. And also keeps the option of castling long and just going for h4, g4, g5, and really leveraging that hook on the h6 pawn to open lines to their king. I think this would definitely be a lot more practically unpleasant for Black, and probably objectively better as well. After bishop g3, I feel like, maybe White loses his advantage just a little bit. Even if you take, you can sort of see how the h file is not really as significant as the g4, g5 plan we saw before. Black is just very, very solid here. But Black played knight e8 instead. It's also a fine move, preparing knight d7 without leaving our bishop on pre. So castles, knight b6. It's true that some of these moves are not the most precise by either side, but for the most part, you could say they played it fairly thematically as such. You can tell even this step with the queen, maybe not absolutely the most precise. But really, the key moment of the game comes up a bit later. So far, I think, that fe4 is probably a bit more natural than knight e4, just keeping the two pawns side by side. But knight takes e4 is not so bad either, to be fair. Your activity with the bishop pair and, the fact that Black's king is a little weak does sort of offset a little bit the isolated pawn. That being said, it is perhaps a sign that, Black is already, starting to suddenly do quite reasonably in this instance. And here, white thought they had this trick of knight to c5, with the idea that, you know, if we're hitting the knight and, you know, if they take the knight, we sort of have this counterattack with, you know, either hitting the knight this way or going queen e4 to kind of save our bishop indirectly. But it turns out there is actually a problem with this, which Zhu Wenjun did spot in the game. And actually, this one I also recognize the puzzle I said in my Facebook group, in fact. Don't think it's necessarily been published yet, but I have it like... Actually, no, this is one I did in fact publish. So, the position looks familiar to you. Maybe that's the reason why. But, okay, the answer here... And if you do want to solve it for yourself, you can pause the video. This is kind of your cue to do that if you do want to solve it. But if not, I'm just going to, you know, or if you have already done the pause and you want the answer, well, let's give it to you. So the answer is that bishop takes c5 is actually winning a piece here. Because the key difference in this version, and again, this kind of relates to the comparison method actually, is that, well, in the version we saw when we played knight takes c5, when we had a bishop instead of a knight, well, we didn't really have a great way of dealing with queen e4 mates. Like, f5 is just strategically so ugly. But with the knight on the board, we've got knight g5 to hit the queen and also cover h7, which means that white is basically just down a piece and, you know, black should basically just win very easily. Now, later on the game actually had some interesting points where Keymer did actually have a chance to draw in an endgame and knight down, with not many pawns left on the board, but, you know, it was a little bit study-like and he didn't see it. And, you know, the normal course of the game eventually played out with, you know, Zhu Wenjun scoring a very impressive victory with the black pieces. So, yeah, in terms of the other games, like Korobov against Erigaisi, yeah, this game was just basically just a preparation duel where I'm not really going to, like, analyze it, but just sort of pointing out that, you know, if you are wondering what to do when I play bishop d3 in this tricky move order, like, just playing an e5 break is just going to be fine for black, and, you know, sort of was borne out in the game, where black, you know, got enough counterplay with this little trick of d4, you know, just kind of using the, you know, the pin to basically liquidate the IQP in a sense. Or in the case of e4, yeah, this was also just basically fine for black. So yeah, interesting from a theoretical point of view, but the game itself, yeah, dried out pretty fast. And Moritzi against Fiddler was also another game where not a whole lot really happened. It was an anti-martial where white was trying to, you know, leverage some very slight pressure, but, you know, Fiddler just defended it well, and the game did end in a draw in not so many more moves from here. So that's why we're going to kind of skip past those games a little bit. As for Erigaisi against Keymer, now we're getting into the round 5 games, and I kind of forget what the exact leaderboard was. Like, I remember that, you know, Korobov was, like, doing quite well in the standings. Like, he might have actually been the leader at this point. I forget whether Erigaisi was also equal in the lead or not at this stage. Because, yeah, he had, was it 1 win or 2 wins? Okay, yeah, he had, like, yeah, 1 win, I think, so far in the event. No, he actually had 2. So, yeah, so basically at this point, Erigaisi and Korobov were sort of equal leaders, and Keymer, yeah, fell off the lead due to a loss to Zhu Wenjun. But yeah, looking at this game here, this one wasn't really, again, all that special. Like, it was just another one of these martials where, you know, black was just very well prepared. And I will say that from a theoretical point of view, this rook a7 move just clearing the way for a discovered attack is definitely a very nice idea. But yeah, the game itself just sort of petered out very quickly, and, you know, not so much to say there. The Svidler-Korobov game was actually quite interesting, though. This one I do want to put a bit of time into. It was a game where I don't think Svidler really got anything out of the opening. Like, this queen d4 is just, yeah, attempt just to kind of avoid Fury and just try to get a position in a sense. Because the old school way to play it was to go bishop b5, and it's sort of funny because I actually did cover this Hungarian variation in a training video somewhat recently on my channel. Which, yeah, you can always look it up for yourself. Yeah, I can't remember if I called it, like, anti-Sicilian or what it was, but yeah, this is sort of was the old school way to play it, where you just sort of go for this very quick development and, you know, can potentially go for a open Sicilian style attack. But in my video earlier, I will mention the point that, you know, nowadays the main trend is to, you know, play it in more of a Maroczy bind kind of style, which is obviously not so feasible when you've already played knight c3 in this version. But Svidler had an idea. He played the move queen e3, and now this move of b3, like, playing it actually a lot like the Carlsen anti-Sicilian with 2 knight c3 d6, d4, as it were. But it's like, yeah, quite a nice setup in this case. You're after queen c7. I think I like rook g1 and g4, g5 as a slightly better as a way of preparing the g4 and this pawn storm. But maybe Svidler just wanted to avoid the move knight g4 altogether, and maybe this is the reason why he played h3 here. We had b5, g4, fairly standard open Sicilian position. I think both sides are probably happy just to get a fighting position on the board here. And white, I think, does have some advantage in this case, where, to my mind, h4 and just going for the attack directly is sort of the way to go. But also in the game, we can see after rook g1 that black, decided he didn't want to castle short in this position. Like, it might be what the computer wants to play, but from a human point of view, castling into the attack is not so ideal. The disadvantage with Korobov's castles long, though, is that when you castle long, you sort of find it much harder to get counterplay on the queen side. Because in a sense, you're kind of pushing the pawns around your own king, which is a little bit weakening. Also, by the way, if knight d4, we would play the move rook d4 most likely and, defend the pawn in that way. Still, maybe this is a way that black should have played it, because this position with, like, e5 and switching to a knight off style of players is actually not so bad in this case. Whereas knight a7, does strike me as being a little bit awkward. It's true that some of the next moves by the players were maybe not absolutely the most precise, let's say. It's true that the time trouble was maybe a side come a little bit of a factor. But really, this was sort of the key moment of the game, where I think if black just plays some logical move like knight e6, preparing like bishop c5, making the point that g5 can be a little bit of a weakness potentially, I think a position like this is just going to be pretty close to equal. White maybe has a little something potentially with his king being a little bit safer, but other than that, I think black shouldn't have any major problems. The problem with the move knight b5 in the game is that after takes and now queen e2, it just becomes very hard for black to defend these pawns. You just become a really major static weakness. And also after the move f6, black's attempt to, try to, give up a pawn to free himself a bit. Svidler just played this really great move of knight to e3, just preparing to jump into d5 and really leverage the weaknesses in black's position. Of course, you can't take on e4 because of the fork on b5 with the king and the rook, as it were. So in the game, white just ended up getting knight to d5 and just having a completely dominant position here. Korobov tried to mix it up with this knight e4, rook d5 trick, but after knight g5... Actually, knight g5 is probably not the most precise, but it ended up doing the job in the game. After rook f2, black had to play like queen takes g5, and if you play this, somewhat surprisingly, actually the position's not sort of over. I can meet queen f2 with king a6, and there's actually no checkmate here. So I would probably bring the bishop in the attack, and still have a big advantage, but it's not it's not at least game over immediately after, say, queen g3, for instance. Where again the king can sort of hide on a6 for some time. But in the game after rook d1, it was basically lights out. Where after queen d8, we just see that white is just completely dominating, where the bishop is actually trapped here. And after queen g1, bishop c1, black just resigned in this position. So quite a fun game. Nice win by Svidler. Maybe it's true that the play wasn't always 100% accurate, but it was definitely an exciting game with some instructive takeaways. The other games, Grandelis against Moritzi was one that, looked like it could get interesting at some point, but it was basically his players just bashing out a ton of Roy Lopez theory and preparation, and the game did end in a draw by a perpetual check. The game between Zhu and Abdusattorov was actually kind of interesting in that it was a bit of a back and forth where, white was kind of better in the sort of early to late middle game, and then Abdusattorov was basically winning at some point in the end game before things kind of petered out to a draw. So this game, I think, is definitely worth a look. So after queen e2, black should probably play the move of queen b6 and just kind of exploit the fact that the pawn on d4 is not so well defended. In fact, it may well be that white's best move is to play something like rook d1 and admit the loss for tempo in a way. But after bishop d7, now white sort of gets the position she wants, like an IQP position, where the black bishops are somewhat negating the pressure against the d4 pawn. Knight e7, bishop g5, just very natural play by black here, by white. Maybe the simplest is just to keep the tension with a move like rook e8, where I think Abdusattorov maybe didn't like knight e4 in response, but I think that the arising position after, say, bishop c6, for instance, is going to be reasonably solid for black. Like, the trade of the bishop for knight is not really the end of the world, because you do get pretty good pressure and a good blockade on d5 in return. So f6, though, I think is just a little bit weakening, where, you know, the e6 pawn is now just as much of a factor as the d4 pawn, and yeah, after just a couple of slightly imprecise moves, like now b4 is actually, it's a really nice move by white, realizing that, you know, you can't actually take the pawn so readily because of the, you know, the tactical problems with the pins, as it were. To clarify, if black does play queen a5, you've got rook takes b4 and a3, and that will allow you to pick up the two minor pieces for the rook. So black goes knight g6 instead, and yeah, white still has a very nice position, like h4, just very thematic to kick that knight out of the way. You know, knight g7, knight c5. So white's still basically kind of dominating here, but at some point, you know, she does lose the control a little bit, and I'm going to fast forward a little bit towards the endgame. Like, I think in this position, like h5 is, as natural as it looks, is probably the point where white kind of lost her advantage, where it might be better just to play like bishop h6 and maybe just play a little bit more with the pieces. You know, move like queen c4 and just kind of, you know, just sort of reshuffle like rook d1, queen b3, bishop c4, and, you know, just get the pieces harmonious as possible first before taking any radical action. But in the game, yeah, I think that white missed this little trick of bishop f5, which does turn the tables a little bit on white here, such that now without the bishop pair advantage, black's knight is going to have a lot more scope than the bishop in the long term, which is something that's kind of borne out by the game continuation, whereas the position simplified more and more. It was black who was basically starting to take control. Let me just fast forward a little bit to the point where black actually had a decisive advantage. Actually, this one's kind of a really nice move that Abdusattorov played. This knight c7 is really very cool, because you're preparing knight b5 to hit the bishop and the rook, which in turn makes rook d3 more effective. You know, you're clearing the way for the king to enter the game, and, you know, even moves like g5, g4, and just fixing all of the white pawns on the dark squares is going to leave white very weak on the light squares. Like, it's just a dream way to play when you've got the knight versus the bishop. So yeah, basically this was, I think, the sort of the key moment of the game to my mind. Maybe I think Abdusattorov might have missed a win later as well, but I think that here, like, rook d3 is a really big opportunity where white has to play rook e3 to keep the minor piece alive, but then take knight d5, and you can just sort of see how, you know, this light square domination is manifesting. You know, you can't really play knight d4 because the passer is going to be blockaded in that case anyway. But knight e1 is just such a passive move. Like, knight e5, the knight can come in, the c4, the king can come in as well. Like, I think this is just going to be a winning endgame for black, simply. So I think that was probably the best chance. I'm just going to quickly check if there was another opportunity to present itself in this game, like where black had a very direct win. But okay, so this actually was the last chance here where black could have won the game. Because what happened in the game is black just ended up grabbing a pawn, but, you know, white just defended really well from this point and was able to save the game with a pawn less, you know, just putting the knight on e4 and just having counterplay on the king side as such. But the way that black could have played it is in this position here. He could have played either knight e4 immediately or first to move rook to b2 and then knight to e4. I guess in this, after king e3, you're probably playing rook b3 anyway, so yeah, kind of easiest just to play knight e4 directly. And yeah, that's going to give you like this rook b2, and it's actually very hard for white to defend her f2 pawn effectively. Because what happens is if you play rook knight d2, black just goes rook b2. And yeah, you're just basically faced with the issue that you're going to lose a piece most likely. Or if they play a move like king e3 to break the pin in this sort of way, well, then we can just cash in like with take, rook b3, and you can sort of see that when you're up a pawn, you're just going to be winning the endgame. Like, you're going to play on the light squares, the white bishop has no scope, and you've got their pawns fixed on the right color complex for yourself. So yeah, you're basically just going to win this endgame. That was a bit of a missed opportunity, and okay, it's true that it didn't end up affecting the final tournament result as much as it might have seemed at the time, but yeah, definitely kind of a key game for the round in round 5. with that, we're now starting to get into the round 6 game, actually. Yeah, and I realized I went a little bit into the weeds of the round sort of 5 game, just because I had a lot of very interesting positions arising and, very instructive exercises there. The Maritzi Drew game was one where Drew just basically played the Petrov, got this very symmetrical position with not a lot happening and just held a very solid draw. So not such an interesting game. As for Korobov against Grandelius, this was a game where, White played a little bit creatively, playing the Martinez variation with h3, and you're basically just playing it kind of like a sort of almost 4 knights reversed in a way, where Magnus is very similar to what we saw with Abdusattorov Grandelius, but with colors reversed. But this time, Korobov did go for the plan of a5 and grabbing that space. I think actually the arising position was quite fine for Black, where I think that in this position, Black should definitely give some serious thought to playing f4 and just going for the mating attack on the king side, essentially. I think that this would ask White some pretty difficult questions. But in the game, Black played queen f6, and it sort of happened that White was just able to kind of slowly outplay Black at some point. At this stage, Black's still doing pretty well with the extra space, but the move knight g6 maybe is a little bit of a step in the wrong direction compared to, let's say, more of a central strategy by comparison. And after knight g6, rook a2 is a nice little defensive move in this way, ensuring there's no bishop g6 a3 tricks reigning. Rook e8, f3 just trades off the extra space, and even this position here, I think Black should still be able to, be reasonably okay, but yeah, the trend is just starting to shift just a little bit in White's favor, and, White just sort of was able to, just kind of steadily improve the position, just sort of leave Black with some little problems with the king safety and piece placement. And yeah, from around this point, just fast forwarding a little bit, because there's just not that many more moves left of the game. You'd sort of say in hindsight that d5 was a decisive mistake, that here Black probably just has to go into a defensive mode and just kind of prepare to deal with the move queen e7, just to at least not lose material as such. But after d5, bishop c2, queen f7, the problem is that now queen g3 is just very, very strong. Because if you play h5, well then the Black king side is suddenly very, very weak, which is a real long-term issue. If you play bishop h5 again, the bishop's kind of misplaced, and you can sort of just, bring the knight in and just make their life absolutely miserable, because these pieces are now also kind of stuck. In the game, after bishop f5, White just took and just grabbed the free pawn, and that was basically that. After knight f3 and queen b7, White's up 2 pawns for nothing. The a pawn's about to queen, and Black doesn't have any counterplay to deal with it, and this is why Black resigned here. So quite a nice game by Korobov, just sort of exploiting Grandelius' mistakes in a more technical sort of position. The Erigaisi Fiddler game was just basically one where, the players just played out some preparation, Black defended well, and the game just ended in a draw in a Marshall Gambit. But yeah, let's move on to, I think, the most interesting game of the round between Keymer against Abdusattorov, and this one I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about, because this was really the game that kind of shapes the sort of the final narrative of the event, or you could say the penultimate narrative of the event. But yeah, this approach of b5 and bishop g4 and a Chebanenko, it's typically thought that White is going to be a bit better with normal play, say bishop e2, h3, this kind of thing. But in the game, White played a4, which is also considered one of the best lines according to the engine. But Abdusattorov is just very good at sort of finding these variations where the computer will initially say that White's slightly better due to, say, the space advantage, but where when you go deeper, it turns out Black's actually just doing fine. Definitely very indicative of the modern approach to chess, not to play the absolute main line, but trying to get the opponent on their own resources so they might make some mistake. At this point, once you get an e5 in the Chebanenko, you're generally going to be doing quite fine, as I also point out on the live chat in this game. As I was watching some of these games live when my sleep patterns were really crazy, but yeah, White played a move knight d3, which I think is fairly normal. Yeah, you do allow e4 with a tempo, but your knight will be quite reasonably placed on f4 in the arising position. In the game, Abdusattorov played ed4, which I think is, fairly similar in value. The engine likes e4 better, but just as a general principle, these sort of structures are going to be fairly healthy for Black, where you're just going to be able to maneuver the knight to e6, as Abdusattorov did, and just really sort of exert that pressure against the d4 pawn. It's definitely a kind of position where even though the engine will tell you it's just equal, black is kind of the one who has the easier position to play in my personal experience, playing these sort of structures with both colours. And bishop b2, yeah, it does defend the pawn in advance. Queen c8 is trying to take advantage of white space disadvantage, if you like, that some squares have been left behind in the white position. Knight g3, rook b8. I'm going to fast forward. Well, I said I was going to fast forward to the key moment, but actually this position itself is kind of a key moment. And, if you are a very, let's say, serious student of chess, I think this actually makes a really good position to pause and to, figure out what you would play as black in this position. Because this was really the move that allowed Abdusattorov to start to take control of the game. So, you might have been thinking of moves like queen b7 to take the b file, or maybe queen a6 to just try to, do something with the queen as such. And those moves are certainly reasonable here, but the move bishop h4 is the clincher. This is why rook a1 was a little bit of a strategic mistake, because we're now able to force that exchange of the bishop for the knight, such that, in a situation like this, well, we're going to have the e4 outpost for our knight, and white's bishop, a bit like we saw in the Zhu Abdusattorov game, actually, the bishop is going to be very passive behind the pawns. In the game, white played f5, trying to change the trend of the game a little bit, with this move of bishop c1, trying to, have some tricks to kind of stay strategically afloat. But the move knight e4 was just a very good reply here, just taking the outpost, because, if white does take, you've got queen e4, and then you're hitting d4, and for rook f4, this is still going to be, you could say, pretty awkward for white, being very overextended. And, when you have a space disadvantage as well, like, the more the pieces get traded, the better it's going to be for you in a way. In the game, white played bishop f4, and I will show you the full game. Like, we don't really have the time to, like, fully analyze it, but I think just even seeing the moves is quite instructive. Like, seeing how black is attacking the pawn on d4 here. And after bishop e5, like, queen e3 just shows a good tactical awareness. King h2, take, d4, queen c4. So black basically wins a pawn in this position. But it's not completely simple, because white does have the move queen a6, which was played in the game. Snap a little bit of a fork. And up to queen c7, it's a position where, like, if white plays the right moves, they will hold. But they do still have to be a little bit precise, where, to my mind, white should probably either have played the move of rook to f4 and, hit the pawn in this way. Or if you do want to go for a very forcing approach, you could probably also make an argument for takes and rook f6, which maybe isn't quite as precise, but it does allow you to get c6 and kind of get the job done as well in a certain sense. Like, in these rook and queen positions, you really want to prioritize the activity of the pieces. But yeah, in the game, after the move f6, it looks quite good to have the fawn pawn, but it just turns out white is not really able to get their queen in to give checkmate. Like, queen a8, you can just block it easily, and in the game after queen e2, okay, it turns out in this position, technically you should play queen b8 and, kind of do it this way, where there are some positions where having the rook defended really helps you a lot. But black played queen d8 in the game, and, at this point, again, the players are very low on time, so you can't expect, like, perfection, but it does sound like probably should have brought the queen to f3, was probably a bit more precise in hindsight. After queen e4, black was sort of able to kind of consolidate. Like, again, queen f4, probably not the most ideal. But yeah, after g4, it's a position where white, probably has enough counterplay to survive now. But after queen f8, white does still have to be quite precise. Where here, the only move actually for white to save the game is the move of rook to e7, with the idea that after takes, and now g takes h5 is the key. Because queen d4 is running into the queen h4 fork as such. But after gh5, it turns out you have just enough counterplay to survive. Where, say, if black goes d3, trying to keep his trump card alive, well, then we can open up their king and play queen to d4. And what happens is either we end up winning back like this pawn, and, we're a pawn down and a queen ending, but the, ending ends up being a draw because of the black king being so open. Or if they do try to defend their pawn, the problem is then you just have perpetual check. Not immediately, you have to find king g3 first, and then you can sort of start giving perpetuals, which, of course, is not the easiest thing to see in an actual game. But yeah, this is basically the key in this case to save it as white. So still white had to find a lot of precise moves, as you can see. And Rook e5 just ends up falling kind of short here because of the move of h takes g4. And after queen g4, black now just plays rook d8, and because of this kind of queen h6 defensive resource, white just can't really get his rook and queen in to mate the black king. The game ended queen e4, queen h6, and yeah, here it's just a matter of just kind of not falling into some fluke mate. So just king g8 keeps everything safe. Queen e4, d2, rook e8, and yeah, this is going to be lights out. And therefore white just resigned here. But yeah, very instructive game. Like, I think this was probably actually my favorite game of the tournament in some ways, which is why I decided to spend some time analyzing it for you guys here. Now, in the last round, actually in the last round, 2 of the games did have some interesting points to them, but this game between Zhu and Korobov was one where basically, I'll just give you like the summary of it, just so the video's not too long. Like, basically black end up sort of getting a better endgame, with white sort of like playing sort of for a draw in a way. And then what happened was like Korobov lost his advantage, and then, you know, it was suddenly Zhu who was kind of pressing for the win, and it ended up that she actually was able to win and, well, finish the tournament on a very nice 50% score, which, considering that she was the bottom seed by nearly 50 rating points and, you know, more than 100 points already in most of the field, obviously, yeah, very, very nice result for it to, you know, achieve that 50% score in this field. But yeah, I want to focus a little more on this, a couple of other games, like the game between Abdusattorov and Maritzi was kind of a game that basically just played out fairly normally for the most part. I realize a5 looks a little bit weird, but, you know, it is a move that was played, for example, in, you know, Wojciech Carlsen in a World Cup a while back. I think 2021, if I remember correctly. But yeah, queen c2, of course, a5 is also going to be a move here, where you sort of make the point that, you know, in some lines you can, you know, try to weaken the white structure if they play b3. So at a3, and the other point is also, yeah, you do have the move a4 to kind of fix the white queen side as a sort of compensation for white taking the center. But yeah, I think that for like both sides like played fairly logical moves for a while. The idea of knight a5 being that, you know, if you do take the pawn, black is going to get reasonable counterplay here where like knight b3, rook moves, rook fc8, and, you know, the tactical point is that you do have the move bishop takes a3 that does allow you to regain the pawn and to equalize in this instance here. So that's why white played queen d3 instead. You know, we had the move c5, and, you know, for this part it looks like it's a fairly normal sort of Catalan, but it is one where white is doing quite well with the space advantage, and, you know, black's pieces maybe not being the most ideally placed. And yeah, just showing very good technique here was Abdusattorov, where here, like, black, yeah, played knight c6 to keep the pawn defended. White went e5, just continuing to really play with the initiative. Rook d7, leveraging that pressure down the long diagonal. Take, and, you know, to black's credit, he defended quite actively. You know, move knight d4, sacking a pawn, but at least getting some freedom for the pieces. Rook b7, rook a7, and, you know, I like the move rook d1 that white played, just putting some pressure on the knight, putting the rook on the open file. Take, bishop a7, and, I mean, here white probably could have just taken the second pawn safely. You know, if the concern is like knight e2, then, yeah, I mean, the connected pass pawn should just win the game. And yeah, Abdusattorov played a bit differently with bishop e4, but still went on to win anyway after some little mistakes by black in the time pressure. But yeah, that sort of allowed Abdusattorov to place this out where if all the other games ended in a draw, or, you know, at least the other co-leaders Korobov and Keymer didn't win, that the game would, or an Erigaisi wouldn't win, that basically, you know, Abdusattorov would make the playoff. Okay, maybe the fate's not in his hands, but at least it gives himself a shot. The game between Svedler and Keymer was one that did have its interesting moments, but was just like a very sort of strategic and slow kind of game where neither side had any massive chances that I could see. But the Grandelius Erigaisi game actually did have a sort of key moment come up where I'm going to kind of fast forward past a lot of these moves just to kind of get to the key position that arose. Like, I realize the opening does have some interesting points, but yeah, I kind of want to get to, yeah, the more meaty part of the game. I mean, we could sort of say the opening was definitely a success for white here, where, you know, in a position like this, white is just clearly better with the bishop pair and the space advantage, and black really struggling to find a good pawn break. But let's get to where the position starts to become a bit more fleshed out or a bit more tense. I mean, it's true, you could sort of make the point that white probably can improve on bishop b2 at this moment, but yeah, in the game, we end up getting this kind of position that, yeah, I mean, if black plays correctly, I think this ending he can basically hold. But with white being up a pawn, it's true only white can really play for a win. And yeah, king f8, white took the pawn, king e7. So white is up 2 pawns, but sort of the point is that his structure is maybe not the most ideal. But fast forwarding a little bit to where we kind of get to the more key moment of the game. So already black has some tricky questions to deal with, like how to defend the pawn on b7. And the move rook b8 sort of looks more solid, say, than, move like king e6 and I guess gambling that you can still, save this ending in a certain sense. But it ends up being a good gamble, like you are able to, regain the pawn and, or at least regain one of the pawns. And, it turns out that this sort of ending is actually basically just going to be a draw because the pawns are just getting liquidated a little bit too fast here. But in the game, black played rook b8 and that allowed white to sort of stamp his control with bishop d5, and b6 was Erigaisi's idea to try to break free, liquidate the pawns, and just make a quick draw. But this fell for a very nice trick by Grandelius of rook to c6. Of course, yeah, if you can get in rook c7 would be very nice. Or, say if bishop f4, even like b5 is kind of a, not a necessary trick, but a fun little trick to kind of get the pass pawn rolling. But in the game, after ba5, rook a6, ab4, white does still have to find some good moves to win from this point. And actually, this was kind of the key moment I really want to share with you guys. Where in this position, it turns out there's actually 2 winning approaches. In the game, white played a move bishop to c6, and this move, while natural, does actually throw away the win. And I think that what maybe Grandelius might have overlooked is he might have thought that he could play bishop d5 and e7 in this position, like just trying to queen the pawn. But okay, it turns out after b7 too that, yeah, in this sort of position, if we play this out, the black does queen with check, and that does allow black the time to save himself. After queen b4, there's just no mate anymore now that the f8 square is covered. I have a feeling maybe it was this queen b4 move that Grandelius may have missed in his initial calculations in time pressure. If you're wondering what white should do instead, I think the most practical solution is just to play bishop b3, just blockade the pawn and just kind of, just play it this way like h5 and, sort of trust that, that this is going to be a winning endgame, but just trying to make the time control solidly. And the more direct way, which is, yeah, sort of a little bit riskier looking, but it turns out you can actually get away with rook h7 because of this key move of bishop to e4. Where, yeah, the b pawn is very strong, but when you have, 4 pawns, you have 3 pawns you've taken, it gives you a few more liberties, let's say. For example, rook a8 might look quite scary, but, well, we can just play rook h8 and win the rook as such. And, yeah, otherwise, you're just going to kind of bring the king up, bring the pawns up, and, at the end of the day, 4 beats 1 is kind of the simple explanation of the position. And of course, I can't take the pawn here because, yeah, of the rook f7 fork. So the tactics just all kind of work for white in a sense. But yeah, in the game, white misplayed it, and, it ended up only being a draw, which meant that Erigaisi still made this three-way playoff that was played between Abdusattorov, Erigaisi, and Svidler. So, yeah, it'd be an interesting question to see who wins it. But because the tournament finished like a day or two ago, yeah, I can already, share with you how it played out. Actually, this game between Abdusattorov and Erigaisi was kind of an interesting one in that basically Erigaisi kind of just outplayed Abdusattorov at some stage where, at some point black just had a completely winning position. Like if I fast forward a little bit to, because all these moves are pretty normal by both sides, but if we fast forward to around, let's say, yeah, this stage, yeah, around this point, yeah, things started to get a little bit hairy for white. Black is threatening bishop h3 with the pin on the g file. White found a creative defense with rook e3, with the idea that bishop h6, free knight h4 is, sort of covering everything in this instance, as you can see. But black then played bishop f4 and just kind of created some of its own problems where you can't just move the rook with bishop h3, but as it was played, white ended up basically sacrificing the exchange. And it's a position where I think, yeah, with correct play, black should be much better, but in the end, yeah, Abdusattorov was sort of able to swindle the draw and basically save the game, as it were. Though to be fair, like, the injury does seem white is sort of lost here, but it is true that the black is better if he, for example, plays like a6 and just kind of more slowly builds up the position. But, I mean, the idea is you just want to, like, move the pawn and, yeah, free the bishop to develop in some way. But, yeah. Let's look at some of the other games as well, because it's true that, like, these games are sort of weird in this playoff where the player who gained the advantage early on was often the player who ended up losing in a weird sense. But then again, it's also true, we all know that, Abdusattorov is, of course, the world's leading expert in swindling bad positions. And yeah, this line he played with knight f6, like, it's one that the computers often will think of, like, white's got some small edge because of the knight looking a little bit awkward. But I think that the way that Abdusattorov played it showed it's actually quite a respectful position for black if he just wants to avoid some fury, where, at this point, white could consider a move like queen d4, just anticipating the discovered attack from the rook. But in the game, we had rook d1, bishop b4, queen f5, and yeah, because these were blitz games, I'm going to be a little bit more brief in my coverage of them. But I think it's sort of reasonable to say that white did have a little bit of an edge out of the opening with his bishop pair advantage. And, if black doesn't do something, we do have to be a little careful of the weakness of d6. So black decided for this reason to play it a little bit directly, going knight e4 and then the move of d5. It turns out, however, this is actually a little bit of a mistake, where at this point, well, maybe mistake is a bit too strong, but white sort of had an interesting opportunity, where he actually could have played the move queen e4, which it looks very unintuitive to give up the bishop pair like this, but the point is that f3 and e4 is actually a very nice endgame for white, where the bishop sort of struggles to find a really great post somehow. And say if knight c7, you can even play like g4 and just really constrict the bishop, and just make this point that your bishop is just a lot better than theirs in the rising position. And that would have been very interesting to see this play out, but in the game, white side just to kind of nurse that bishop pair advantage, which certainly looks very natural, but it also kind of allows black the time to, yeah, to sort of try and, like, sort of balance the chances a bit. Although, to be fair, I think the position of the rose here is just very, very good for white, where, actually a move like a4 and just sort of preparing a5 and a6 in the spirit of the Uwe versus Alukin World Championship match would I think, be really strong here. But bishop f4, of course, is always going to be playable as well. Knight dc4, a4. And yeah, now the difference here with these moves thrown in is that c5 does become a bit more viable. Knight b5, take, and yeah, g5 looks like a mistake, but it's actually quite a strong move in this position. So that after bishop c4, that, they can't take back with the rook, and yeah, we get this dynamic play to sort of offset our weaknesses a little bit, where, here white probably has to find a move of queen e2 if he wants to keep any sort of advantage. Whereas after queen c2, yeah, it allowed the queen to kind of come in. Although it turns actually this position here is still going to be very good for white after queen f2. Like, at this point, you'd think that white's the one who's going to be more likely to win this game. But yeah, then things got kind of messy. Like, rook d2, king e3, rook b2. And yeah, with the move c4, black actually is getting some quite decent counterplays, it turns out, with the c-pawn and the active rook. The game continued rook b7, rook b5, and, of course, knight d5 is a threat to win the exchange. So king d4 gets out of the way of that. Rook b4, king c5, rook to b1, hitting the bishop like so. Bishop c4, knight a4, and yeah, it's true that white is a pawn up currently. However, it's also true that his king is very offside, and with this little trick of g4, Abdusattorov is basically able to set it so if white takes, that this is just going to be like just a very drawish endgame. Like, you just basically have a fortress on the dark squares in the absolute worst case. And of course, like king d5, yeah, you just have knight f6 to fork and regain the pawn directly as such. So I tried to keep the game going with f4, but then a little bit of a tragedy struck after bishop e2, h5. Because, like, almost any normal move here, like, if you just move the bishop to some healthy square, it's going to be a draw. Because you can't quite, like, get the knight in to, take the pawn and sort of, consolidate fully. But unfortunately, white found basically the worst move on the board in king d5, which does just lose to knight c3, forking king and bishop, and white just resigned. A little bit of a tragic end to the game, but yeah, sometimes these things happen in blitz chess. I don't know if they had an increment necessarily or not. I guess if I Okay, so they did have actually a little bit of an increment. So it's not like white was about to flag anyway. But yeah, a little bit unfortunate as it kind of killed Svidler's chances to win the playoff. And yeah, Erigaisi also won against Svidler, where I think this was another game where black was actually winning at some point and then just kind of missed some trick and just end up losing. Kind of unfortunate, but yeah, it is what it is. And that sort of left basically this game between like the sort of another playoff again between Abdusattorov against Erigaisi, still blitz. But we kind of know that one of these players now will win the tournament. And I think the first game was actually one where, if I remember correctly, I think Abdusattorov was actually winning in this game, where in this position he came up with a very creative idea, like the mainline Sierra to either play knight bd5 and try to leverage a d6 square, or to play something like takes and e5 and, play this sort of thing, like very direct and forcing play for both sides. But the move queen e3 is kind of an interesting shortcut, and actually when I saw it, I ended up even like playing it in a bullet game myself recently, just to see how it played out. Now, the disadvantage of queen d3 is that, black can play quite forcingly with like d5 and, knight b4 and just try to like really force the play and just equalize in a very, very direct fashion. I mean, even here you can probably still make the point that, with a3, white has probably still got a little bit of an advantage in a position like this. But yeah, I mean, black should, I think, be in general doing fine. Of course, knight c7 is met by queen e4, so it's not like, you're just winning a rook in this position as white. So, you probably just go knight c3, and yeah, it's just a position at this point. But black played to move d6 instead, playing a little bit more cautiously. And that sort of allowed white some different dynamic options. Like, for example, here you could castle long and you go f4, g4, g5, and really put black under a lot of pressure if they don't go for something quite precise, like a d5 break at some point, for instance. But black played bishop d7, which, yeah, I mean, probably the normal move is just to castle and just go for the plan I just mentioned, but white tried to be a bit direct and punish him with the move knight d to b5. And yeah, in this case, black played knight b4, queen d2, a6, and sort of led back to kind of a fairly normal position in the end, like castles and just like very classical Scheveningen style play where, black should definitely be doing quite fine here, like knight a5 and bring your knight towards c4 is obviously very thematic for the Sicilian. And yeah, for this point, actually, black is probably the one who is actually going to have the advantage. Like here, if black just takes, it's true that, white is stuck with these doubled pawns. And actually, a very nice trick when you're playing the Sicilian as black is to ask constantly, like, can we play the d5 break? Even when it looks like you can't play it, because after d5, we do have some tricks with bishop to c6, where we get back the pawn and take over the center. Normally, the argument against d5 is that white can go e5 and just get a good kind of Steinitz French structure, but of course, white's not really placed to do that here. But black played king h8, which sort of allowed white to kind of, get his act together a little bit. And, now this threat of bishop e6 is actually quite nettlesome for black. We're after take. Because if you play knight d7, then the move b4 makes it really hard for you to avoid the loss of material with b5. This is, I think, the point maybe that had escaped black during the game. So black goes queen b8, and white is just kind of sort of grinding black down here. Where yeah, just very hard for black to kind of get his pieces out in such a position. Okay, it's true the moves weren't absolutely the best for this point, but I do want to fast forward to kind of a key moment that came up later in the game. At this point, it's true that white has kind of lost control once again. Like, this was just a very swingy back and forth kind of game. But yeah, if we go to around this point, where white's up a pawn, just let me fast forward just a little bit to, yeah, just let me find the position, because there was a point where white was just completely winning and white kind of missed it, and yeah, it was, yeah, around, it's kind of funny because actually there were a lot of missed wins, but yeah, this was around the point I kind of wanted to show, because at this point, probably the easy way to win it as white is just to simplify and go for a position like this where your rook just goes behind their passer and your b-pawn kind of acts as sort of a shield, like almost like a bridge you're kind of building, where basically, it's very hard for them to get their rook behind the pass pawn when our pawn is sort of blocking that. So something like this would actually just be basically just winning for white, because their difficulty is just stopping the pawn with the rook as such. Now the move g5 is also winning, but I think it's a little bit trickier now, where now you actually have to be quite precise as white. Where, again, the move white has to find is the move of rook to b8. Not fearing the advance of the h-pawn, but realizing that, we will put our rook behind the pawn at the right moment. And that if they play king d6, we have this move of rook c7 even. Okay, to be fair, king b5 should also win in fairness. So it's not like you need to see rook c7. But it just, you're basically aiming for a setup like this, where you have like rook h7, you stop their pawn, and then you sort of queen their pawn, having cut off their king and rook, and that allows you to win the game, basically. But instead, white played the move f4 first, trying to have his cake and eat it. But that meant that in this position, like, now black was sort of having enough counterplay. Actually, it turns out a3 is probably a mistake. Like, black had to probably go rook f3 and, stop the whole rook b8 idea in that sense. But so it turns out here, white's actually winning once again. But he has to find the move of rook to g7 and sort of go back to this kind of plan we mentioned. And like here, it's not as obvious because black does have, rook h4 and, this pawn does look like it's just queening. But it turns out that after rook f7 that you are able to just make it in time here. Because you are queening with check, which is really the key in the, in these queen and rook type positions that you're the one attacking first. Because both kings just very exposed this late in the game. And if rook h8, that sort of buys you the time to play like rook h7. And this is sort of the key trick you need to see to win it as white. And it turns out, that position will be a win, as it were. So, not the easiest variation to see in time trouble, but I think that being exposed to these kind of endgame tactics, while it makes the video a bit longer, I think it really is a great way just to improve your chess skill in general, to see, how these sort of dynamic rook endgames play out, and to give you some, some actionable, some actionable kind of tricks you can use in your own games, essentially. In the actual game, white end up just sort of accepting a mass simplification of position, and it just end up being a draw. Which brings us to our final game of the playoff, and as you can see from the results here, this one I'm just going to flip the board around for. But basically with this win, Abdusattorov was able to win the playoff and win the whole tournament on the tiebreak. However, it could have very easily gone the other way, as actually there was a moment where Erigaisi could have actually just completely trapped and just outright won Abdusattorov's queen. I think this approach of just playing the exchange variation rather than, say, e5 or c5 or e3, c5 or a4, I think there is merit to going for the exchange Slav in these sort of situations, because, it's a case where you can just sort of play for a win without any real risk. Like, for example, bishop f5, e3, e6, you can play moves like, queen b3 and, ask like some slightly tricky questions with the extra tempo. But in the game, Abdusattorov played e6, sort of saying, well, I don't care all that much about equalizing, but just want to kind of get a bit of a tense position to try to outplay the opponent. A move like knight e5 could also be considered, just building the tension that way, but in the game, white goes for the move bishop g3 first. We had castles, bishop d3, rook to e8. I mean, the idea of rook e8 is you want to go e5 and just try to get some isolated pawn position and free your bishop. And while that sort of position is still probably going to be a bit better for white, I think that the move knight e5 is quite logical. And bishop takes e5, maybe doesn't have the desired effect in this version. Because when white's able to play f4 and just keep this pawn defended, it's just strategically very tough for black to play. So I think maybe there was some nerves at play for Abdusattorov here, like with some of these like strategic mistakes that, you maybe wouldn't normally expect from a super grandmaster. But of course, like we all know, like that, he more than makes up for it by being like incredibly tricky in these bad positions. Like basically in bad positions, like he will play like even better than Carlsen from a practical sort of level. Which might sound a bit crazy to say, but I do think it's fair. Like this is a good example, like this knight b4 is like continuing to find tricks to not make it easy for white. Like for example, knight d4, you're already running into, takes and bishop b5 and, just being able to see those tricks really is often the hallmark of being a good defender. White played, I think, a good move here of rook to f3, just, keeping the tension in the position, and, not being so afraid of knight a2, because it is true that you are going to have a very strong initiative, and you are also going to get your pawn back in any case, with a very strong attack on the king's side to follow, because of the space advantage around the king. So queen b6, even though the computer says it's a mistake, you can sort of understand a little bit why he went for this active approach. Now, it turns out the queen b3 pin is actually pretty problematic. Like, if white finds this, he probably will just win the game, because getting out of a3 is actually not so easy to do here. But white played bishop f2, which, you know, to be fair, is also a move in this position. It's also going to be quite strong. But yeah, this was basically the key moment of the game, where after queen takes b2, so I'd end up playing rook c2, which end up basically losing the advantage. What white had to see here was the move of rook to b3, and then the move rook a1 basically traps the queen. Now, it turned out it's not quite Resigned's territory, because you do have this tricky move of queen a4, where you're sort of able to, you know, limit your losses to a piece after something like this. But it is true, white is a piece up and, you know, should win this position with correct play. And I think it shouldn't be too hard for a player of Erigaisi's caliber to convert it. But yeah, in the game, rook c2 was played. Like, there's a bit of a, let's say, double oversight by the players here. I'd say the rising position was basically just fine for, well, I guess fine, like, relative to before. Like, white does still have some pressure. But yeah, queen b3 was actually a little bit of, a double miss, where both of the players missed this move of bishop e4 to, like, win a pawn with a tactic. And so the game, I guess, took a more normal kind of course after knight g6. Rook b4, bishop b5, you know, a4 was played. And once again, yeah, this position is one where, like, Abdusattorov saw the idea that you can play bishop c4 and use the pin in this way. But, you know, the omnipresent computer will point out, like, you have rook c4 and you can, yeah, kind of get the idea in the better version, where you're able to, yeah, trade off their good rook as well, in a sense, to, well, to basically win a pawn after, say, takes. And, you know, this is kind of the whole point of black's play. But okay, it's been a long tournament. You know, players obviously, you know, getting a little tired at this point, you could say. After bishop c4, bishop e6 is a nice trick by white, just getting into an ending that, you know, white should be able to hold, but, you know, still you can ask a few questions. Like, white's best bet here is probably actually just to sacrifice the pawn, but kind of make the point that, because you're getting this rooks on the 7th rank, that, yeah, you've still got enough activity to kind of compensate for it, like h4 or knight d4, and you're just going to kind of get the pieces in, and it's just going to be very hard for black to make progress. Because you're also just going to put your rook behind the passed pawn as well to neutralize their play. But white played rook d4 in the game, and, you know, it is true, it's a little bit of a mistake to give up the pawn on f4, but, you know, it's not like white is dead here by any means. You know, move like rook d8 maybe is the play just to get the rook active directly, but in the game, black decided to make luft for the king, and after rook b6, yeah, now black sort of started to take control a little bit once again. Like, rook b8 is actually a really nice move in this position. And what Abdusattorov realized, and, well, it was realized in the game, its continuation itself, is that rook a6, rook b2, that basically black's threats with, you know, collecting these pawns, is these weaknesses on the king's side, is going to be more significant than white having a passed a pawn. Because as you can see from the game continuation, black just puts the rook behind the passed pawn, takes, and just kind of rolls his own pawns forward. And there's actually not a whole lot that white can really do about this. Of course, you're not going to just fall for knight e6, a3, knight e6 so easily. Black just goes king g6. And yeah, just kind of, you know, is ready to, you know, just get his king out of the checks, king h5. And yeah, I mean, at this point, the game is just over. Like, they played a lot more moves, but the result was never really in doubt here. This is a nice trick, by the way, that rook g5, rook g1 does. You know, win the rook with the skewer. King g3, rook g1, and yeah, it was pretty straightforward. Like, you know, black took his time, making sure not to give white any even smidgen of a chance. But yeah, it was always clear that black was going to win this. And yeah, even giving up a pawn, it was still a theoretically winning endgame for black. Like, if you had the pawn on the f file instead of e file, that version actually would be a theoretical draw. But yeah, when a pawn's separated by 3 ranks like this, it's just going to be pretty easy. Like, just push the pawn at the right moment and just kind of go from there. A3, of course, being a nice trick that you can trade off the rooks in that sense if they were to take it. But yeah, once again, gets h2, it's just going to be easy, where the white king is cut off, and yeah, white just resigned in this position. So yeah, that is how Abdusattorov won the Sigeman tournament, and I realized that this was a very long recap because we were covering like 8 rounds equivalent with this. But I think it's also kind of fun, like, just do a really deep dive into a tournament, and, you know, rather than doing it in a kind of a gossipy sort of style of, oh, this player did this or that player did that, to focus on from all like the chess improvement perspective, like sharing with you the actual like most instructive positions from the game, so that you can learn a lesson from them and basically come out of this training as a stronger chess player, which is essentially the reason I kind of create these videos in the first place, as it were, to help you guys out with your chess. And on that note, do let me know in the comments below, what was, let's say, the most beautiful, like the most interesting move that you kind of saw in this game. Or another way you could look at it is also like, what was your favorite game that we looked at here? It'll be interesting to see what your answers are. Where, yeah, for me, it's probably the Keymer Abdusattorov game. I think maybe made the biggest impression on me is kind of my feeling. But yeah, a lot of good choices. I think yes, there's no right or wrong choice for this one. But definitely interested to know your thoughts. And it's not the first time I mentioned this, like I mentioned early in the video, but I do want to let you know that I do also have a free Facebook group as well, Adult Chess Improvers, which I put the link to in the description below. Something I have planned for there is actually to include some training videos there, sort of exclusive to the group, like they're not even going to be on YouTube. Just a way to kind of give some additional value for you to kind of help you out in that sense. Because with YouTube, like if I just did a training video like every single day, like it sort of can have some diminishing returns. I think it's kind of nice to have some different resources in different places. I think most of you watching this like might be maybe also watching like for a bit of the entertainment point of view, whereas Adult Chess Improvers is like really focused on those who are really wanting to improve your chess, and maybe you're not like spending a lot of time watching Twitch streams, for example, and like using YouTube like really to try to get better in chess rather than just for entertainment. But anyway, that being said, I look forward to seeing you guys in the due course, like whether that's in the group or it's in the next training video. But yeah, whatever the case may be, take care until the next one.